to the Tank podcast. In this week's episode, Caroline Issa decodes Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class, a pioneering critique of conspicuous consumption and the spending habits of the rich.
The Theory of the Leisure Class, an economic study of institutions, was first published in 1899 and was written by Thorstein Veblen, an American economist. The Theory of the Leisure Class is a massively important and influential book on economics and society. It was written at the height of what was called the Gilded Age, a period in which industrialization was creating a lot of new wealth, a bit like tech today. Veblen was critical of the way this wealth was distributed. In other words, he was wondering what the concentration of wealth amongst the 1% was going to do. The Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg of the day were the rubber, coal, and oil barons, the folks who had created monopolies in certain new raw materials or manufactured goods that were all the rage in the dawn of the 20th century and her first made bling thing. You know that tycoon meme from the age of steam with a billionaire dressed like the landlord in Monopoly, lighting his cigar with a $100 bill? This is the book that called out conspicuous consumption and the waste it generated. Veblen tried to look at the root causes of the conditions. He wanted to figure out where these people came from and what made them to be who they were, and importantly, how their spending habits not only formed them as people, but also shaped the society around them. And that was one of the most radical and interesting things he did. Before him, people hadn't considered how people spend their money. Everyone assumed that people spend money on needs. Veblen showed that these folks spent money, often vast sums of money, on what they wanted just because they wanted it. More than anything else, consumption for them was a byproduct or a signifier of the fact that they had leisure time in which to indulge their want. This book was an immediate hit and an international bestseller. It is perhaps the first bestseller on economics, which can be such a dry subject, a bit like Thomas Piketty's Capital, which was published in 2013. A Theory of the Leisure Class wasn't just the first book on economics that got mainstream attention. It also had an amazing cultural impact, mostly because it foresaw the disaster of the Great Wall Street crash some 29 years later. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a newborn baby when the book was published, and it's hard to imagine his masterpiece, The Great Gatsby, which is often called the first great American novel, what it would have been written without Veblen. Because each and every character, their foibles, habits, and their doom is already anticipated by Veblen. Veblen was writing from the midst of the Gilded Age. The Industrial Revolution had enabled the creation of a new class of supremely wealthy industrialists, like J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller, trickle down through the newspapers and film reels to the middle-class rung below. The new millionaires soaked up land and capital, paving the way for the vast imbalances of wealth that also parallels what exists today, not to mention the insane new capacity for extravagant spending on luxuries. Veblen starts his story at the very beginning of human society, where he assumed bands of roving hunter-gatherers spread out across the earth. Veblen's anthropology is not exactly precise. He seems to have in mind a generalized nomadic group, presumably hard at work, tracking down woolly mammoths and foraging berries. But the origins of his argument is found in the early divergence of forms of labor between the hunters and the gatherers. Quote, "There is in all barbarian communities a profound sense of the disparity between man's and woman's work. His work may contribute to the maintenance of the group, but it is felt that it does so through an excellence and an efficacy of a kind that cannot, without derogation, be compared with the uneventful diligence of the woman. The men's aggressive assertion of force and sagacity differs obviously from the women's assiduous and uneventful shaping of materials. Those employments which are to be classed as exploit are worthy, honorable, noble. Other employments which do not contain this element of exploit, and especially those which imply subservience or submission, are unworthy, debasing, and noble. When viewed in the light of that modern common sense which has guided economic discussion, this fact seems formal and insubstantial. But it persists with great tenacity as a commonplace perception even in modern life, as is shown, for instance, by our habitual aversion to menial employments. It is a distinction of a personal kind, of superiority and inferiority." End quote. Just a little sexist, no? In Veblen's formulation, this is how women's work, manual labor, mending, sewing, factory labor, will become disdained. In an argument with shades of Marx, Veblen declares that the beginning of the concept of property is the point at which the leisure class began in earnest. Quote, "The earliest form of ownership is an ownership of the woman by the able-bodied men of the community. The original reason for the seizure and appropriation of women seems to have been their usefulness as trophies. The practice of seizing women from the enemy as trophies gave rise to a form of ownership marriage, resulting in a household with a male head. From the ownership of women, the concept of ownership extends itself to include the products of their industry, and so there arises the ownership of things as well as of persons. In this way, a consistent system of property and goods is gradually installed." End quote. In Veblen's view, as soon as the predatory stage of culture gives way to the propertied phase, the leisure class is born. He coined the term pecuniary emulation, another way of describing the specific blend of jealousy and longing you feel about someone else's Maserati. Yet it's not just about being better than your friends, but knowing yourself to be a good person, as the esteem of your peers is inextricable from self-esteem. Quote, "So soon as the possession of property becomes the basis of popular esteem, therefore it becomes also a requisite to the complacency which we call self-respect. In any community where goods are held in severalty, it is necessary, in order to his own peace of mind, that an individual should possess as large a portion of goods as others with whom he is accustomed to class himself. And it is extremely gratifying to possess something more than others. But as fast as a person makes new acquisitions and becomes accustomed to the resulting new standard of wealth, the new standard forthwith ceases to afford appreciably greater satisfaction than the earlier standard did." End quote. Unfortunately, no amount of wealth is ever enough. Quote, "So long as the comparison is distinctly unfavorable to himself, the normal, average individual will live in chronic dissatisfaction with his present lot, and when he has reached what may be called the normal pecuniary standard of the community, or of his class in the community, this chronic dissatisfaction will give place to a restless straining to place a wider and ever-widening pecuniary interval between himself and this average standard." End quote. This explains why the leisure class exists in largely the same form now, 120 years after Veblen created this theory. As far as wealth is inextricable with social organization, it will infuse the individual on the very essential level of his sense of self. Veblen coined the term conspicuous leisure to describe the requirement to publicly express one's own wealth. Quote, "In order to gain and to hold the esteem of men, it is not sufficient merely to possess wealth or power. The wealth or power must be put in evidence." End quote. Participating in productive labor is felt to be instinctively demeaning. Once this is calcified as a taboo, its effects can be deadly. Quote, "In persons of a delicate sensibility who have long been habituated to the gentle manners, the sense of shamefulness of manual labor may become so strong that, at a critical juncture, it will even set aside the instinct of self-preservation. So, for instance, we are told of certain Polynesian chiefs who, under the stress of good form, preferred to starve rather than carry their food to their mouths with their own hands. It is true, this conduct may have been due, at least in part, to an excessive sanctity or taboo attaching to the chief's person. The taboo would have been communicated by the contact of his hands, and so would have made anything touched by him unfit for human food." A better illustration, or at least a more unmistakable one, is afforded by a certain king of France, who is said to have lost his life through an excess of moral stamina in the observance of good form. In the absence of the functionary whose office it was to shift his master's seat, the king sat uncomplaining before the fire and suffered his royal person to be toasted beyond recovery. End quote. But leisure is more complex than the idea of simply doing nothing. Quote, "It has already been remarked that the term leisure, as here used, does not connote indolence or quiescence. What it connotes is non-productive consumption of time. But the whole of the life of the gentleman of leisure is not spent before the eyes of the spectators who are to be impressed with that spectacle of honorific leisure which in the ideal scheme makes up his life. For some part of the time, his life is perforce withdrawn from the public eye, and of this portion which is spent in private, the gentleman of leisure should, for the sake of his good name, be able to give a convincing account. This can be done only indirectly, through the exhibition of some tangible, lasting results of the leisure so spent. But leisure in the narrower sense, as distinct from exploit and from any ostensibly productive employment of effort on objects which are of no intrinsic use, does not commonly leave a material product. The criteria of a past performance of leisure therefore commonly takes the form of immaterial goods. Such immaterial evidences of past leisure are quasi-scholarly or quasi-artistic accomplishments, and a knowledge of processes and incidents which do not conduce directly to the furtherance of human life. So, for instance, in our time there is the knowledge of the dead languages and the occult sciences, of correct spelling, of syntax and prosody, of the various forms of domestic music and other household art, of the latest properties of dress, furniture, and equipage, of games, sports, and fancy-bred animals such as dogs and racehorses." End quote. There is a secondary industry of employment, therefore, defined precisely by its being non-work. Consider Mark Zuckerberg's declaration in 2011 that he would only eat meat he had personally killed. Jeff Bezos, the richest man in history, spends his spare time gliding around on the ocean floor, looking for parts of NASA's spaceships that have broken off when the crafts re-enter the atmosphere. In the theory of the leisure class, Veblen's most significant coinage was the concept of conspicuous consumption, the public expenditure and consumption of products on a lavish scale. But there's also no point in just consuming the good stuff. You have to do so in a manner that befits your station. Quote, "The quasi-peaceable gentleman of leisure not only consumes the stuff of life beyond the minimum required for subsistence and physical efficiency, but his consumption also undergoes a specialization as regards the quality of the goods consumed. He consumes freely and of the best in food, drink, narcotics, shelter, services, ornaments, apparel, weapons and accoutrements, amusements, amulets, and idols or divinities. This growth of punctilious discrimination as to qualitative excellence in eating, drinking, etc., presently affects not only the manner of life, but also the training and intellectual activity of the gentleman of leisure. He becomes a connoisseur in creditable viands of various degrees of merit, in manly beverages and trinkets, in seemly apparel and architecture, in weapons, games, dancers, and narcotics. This cultivation of aesthetic faculty requires time and application, and the demands made upon the gentleman in this direction therefore tend to change his life of leisure into a more or less arduous application to the business of learning how to live a life of ostensible leisure in a becoming way. Closely related to the requirement that the gentleman must consume freely and of the right kind of goods, there is the requirement that he must know how to consume them in a seemly manner." End quote. apologies to the football fans, but an interest in sports is also evidence of an individual's essential barbarian nature. Quote, sports of all kinds are of the same general character, including prize fights, bullfights, athletics, shooting, angling, yachting, and games of skill. The ground of an addiction to sports is an archaic spiritual constitution, the possession of the predatory emulative propensity and a relatively high potency, a strong proclivity to adventuresome exploit, and to the infliction of damage is especially pronounced in those employments which are in colloquial usage specifically called sportsmanship. It is perhaps truer, or at least more evident, as regards sports than as regards the other expressions of predatory emulation already spoken of, that the temperament which inclines men to them is essentially a boyish temperament. The addiction to sports, therefore, in a peculiar degree, marks an arrested development of the man's moral nature. This peculiar boyishness of temperament in sporting men immediately becomes apparent when attention is directed to the large element of make-believe that is present in all sporting activity. Sports share this character of make-believe with the games and exploits to which children, especially boys, are habitually inclined, end quote. Not only are people conditioned to like expensive things, the primacy of expensiveness also distorts our sense of what is beautiful. Veblen illustrates this with the dog, of whom he was not a big fan, accusing him of being, quote, the filthiest of the domestic animals in his person and the nastiest in his habits, end quote. Maybe he was more of a cat person. Veblen goes on to talk about the overbred dog as a metaphor for the ugliness we can learn to love through the virtue of its expensiveness. Quote, even those varieties of the dog which have been bred into grotesque deformity by the dog fancier are in good faith accounted beautiful by many. These varieties of dogs are rated and graded in aesthetic value, somewhat in proportion to the degree of grotesqueness and instability of the particular fashion which the deformity takes in the given case. The commercial value of canine monstrosities, such as the prevailing styles of pet dogs, both for men's and women's use, rests on their high cost of production, and their value to their owners lies chiefly in their utility as items of conspicuous consumption. End quote. One of the most important products that showcases membership in the leisure class is clothing. In its refusal to accommodate movement, clothing showcases that the wearer need not participate in employment. Quote, much of the charm that invests the patent leather shoe, the stainless linen, the lustrous cylindrical hat, and the walking stick, which so greatly enhance the native dignity of the gentleman, comes of their pointedly suggesting that the wearer cannot, when so attired, bear a hand in any employment that is directly and immediately of any human use. The dress of women goes even farther than that of men in the way of demonstrating the wearer's abstinence from productive employment. It needs no argument to enforce the generalization that the more elegant styles of feminine bonnets go even farther towards making work impossible than does the man's high hat. The woman's shoe adds the so-called French heel to the evidence of enforced leisure afforded by its polish, because this high heel obviously makes any, even the simplest and most necessary manual work extremely difficult. The same is true even in a higher degree of the skirt and the rest of the drapery which characterizes women's dress. The substantial reason for our tenacious attachment to the skirt is just this: it is expensive, and it hampers the wearer at every turn and incapacitates her for all useful exertion. What's more, the essence of fashionableness itself is a note of conspicuous consumption. Veblen's theory is that clothing goes in and out of style due to an inherent conflict between the desire for it to be functional and the desire for it to be conspicuously expensive. As he sees it, this is what underpins the eternal, miserable quest for fashionable status. Quote, the norm of conspicuous waste is incompatible with the requirement that dress should be beautiful or becoming, and this antagonism offers an explanation of that restless change in fashion, which neither the canon of expensiveness nor that of beauty alone can account for. The standard of reputability requires that dress should show wasteful expenditure, but all wastefulness is offensive to native taste. All men, and women perhaps even in a higher degree, abhor futility, whether of effort or of expenditure, much as nature was once said to abhor a vacuum. But the principle of conspicuous waste requires an obviously futile expenditure, and the resulting conspicuous expensiveness of dress is therefore intrinsically ugly. The ostensible usefulness of the fashionable details of dress is always so transparent to make-believe, and their substantial futility presently forces itself so boldly upon our attention as to become unbearable, and then we take refuge in a new style. But the new style must conform to the requirement of reputable wastefulness and futility. Its futility presently becomes as odious as that of its predecessor, and the only remedy which the law of waste allows us is to seek relief in some new construction, equally futile and equally untenable. Hence the essential ugliness and the unceasing change of fashionable attire." End quote. Veblen couldn't have imagined quite how conspicuous consumption would get. In our present moment, where anyone can film themselves unboxing something expensive in their bedroom, there's no shortage of people desperate to make their consumption obvious and evident. Yet, there is now a cultish valorization of work within the leisure classes, where the wealthy need to conspicuously labor. Kim Kardashian at law, Molly May at self-marketing, in order to justify their affluence. Arguably, the theory of the leisure class was the first step towards a series of programs, projects, reforms, and regulations enacted by President Roosevelt in the United States between 1933 and 1938, known as the New Deal. These reforms included the establishment of fiscal overseeing bodies to prevent market manipulation and drastically reined in the power and influence of the banks. Veblen's theory, which named and described the new phenomenon of the leisurely minted, laid the foundation. As Veblen reminds us, those qualities that served us in the early stages of human culture can no longer be considered worthy pillars around which to construct a culture and an economy. Quote, "The two barbarian traits, ferocity and astuteness, go to make up the predacious temper or spiritual attitude. Both are highly serviceable for individual expediency and a life looking to invidious success. Both also have a high aesthetic value. Both are fostered by the pecuniary culture. But both alike are of no use for the purposes of the collective life." End quote. Economics isn't just a branch of mathematics, but a large part of it is predicated by human psychology, behavior, and social relations, that it is generated by people, not by natural forces, and it can be controlled and affected by people. So next time anyone tells you they don't understand the economy, tell them they are not to be so silly. They are the economy. In the cosmopolitan carousel of modern life, where fashion and finance dance in a dizzying waltz, Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class is like a vintage cocktail that never goes out of style. Written in the sunset of the 19th century, it's a critique of America's Gilded Age, a time when wealth wasn't just a number, but a performance. It's tantalizing to think that Veblen, in his somewhat austere manner, was dissecting society much like we do today over brunch, but with a lot more academic jargon and a lot less mimosa. Veblen's world was one where the affluent engaged in what he famously termed conspicuous consumption. This wasn't just about having the best, but about being seen having the best. Sound familiar? In our era of Instagram influencers and luxury brand drops, we're still very much living in a world where your value can feel as ephemeral as your latest post. Veblen would have had a field day with our social media, where every like is a tacit nod to our own conspicuous consumption. But Veblen wasn't just a social critic, he was a keen observer of human behavior. He saw that this consumption wasn't just about materialism. It was a language, a way the leisure class communicated their status. It's like wearing Manolo Blahniks. It's not just about the shoe, but about what wearing that shoe says. In Veblen's time, this was about horse-drawn carriages and silver tea services. Today, it's the designer bags and the exclusive vacation spots. Another parallel that's hard to ignore is the way Veblen's leisure class perpetuated their status. It wasn't just about spending, it was about not working. There's an irony here in our 21st century hustle culture, where being busy is a badge of honor. Yet, even now, there's a subtle undercurrent, a reverence for those who can afford to live lavishly without visibly toiling. It's the dream of passive income, of living that influencer life without the 9-to-5 grind. Veblen would say it's the same old song, just remixed for the digital age. And let's talk about the gender dynamics. Veblen highlighted how women in the leisure class were often trophies, their ornate dresses and leisurely lives symbols of their husband's wealth. Fast forward to today, and while much has changed, thankfully, the remnants of these dynamics linger in subtler forms, in the power couples of business and entertainment, in the branding of the perfect life on social media. What makes Veblen's work enduringly relevant is its exploration of the social and cultural dimensions of wealth. It's not just about money, it's about power, class, and the performance of status. It's the same drama, whether it's Rockefeller's New York or Carrie Bradshaw's Manhattan. As we navigate our world of crypto wealth and tech billionaires, Veblen's insights offer a mirror to our own society. We're still fascinated by wealth, still engaged in its conspicuous display, and still navigating the complex social dynamics it creates. Just like the leisure class of the Gilded Age, we're caught in the spectacle of our own status symbols, whether they're skyscrapers or Snapchat stories. In the end, Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class isn't just a book about the past. It's a conversation about the present and a question about the future. It asks us to look critically at our own society, to see beyond the glitter and glamour, and to ponder the real cost of our conspicuous consumption. And as we sit in our favorite cafe, sipping our artisanal coffee, it's a reminder that some things, like the pursuit of status, are timeless.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.